Welcome to our series of conversations, and today we're visiting again with Dr. Larry Crabb. I hope you've had a chance to see part one and part two of this series of how to have meaningful conversations. So Larry's going to come on and he's going to tell us a little bit about why heaven is such a significant part of the larger story. So Larry, welcome. Glad you can be with us.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's get us into this a little bit and talk about the subject of heaven. I have to confess, Larry, as a kid, and I imagine there's others out there that maybe even today think, really, heaven? We have this vision of eternity. I remember as a kid thinking forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and thinking, wow, that's a long time. And from my perception, that was like being in a continual session of church with him singing and my bottom hurting and wanting to go out and play and do other things. But I think even as adults, we may not have a real perception of what that eternity with the presence of God may be like. And I know this is a passion of yours. In fact, you have a book that's just being released on this, and people have the opportunity to pre-order that from you. We'll put that up on the screen for people to find some information about that. But I'd like for you to just explore a bit about why heaven is so significant in terms of what you define as the larger story. And you might want to just quickly say what the larger story is, again, as relates to the smaller story, in case people haven't seen part two.
Well, I do think that it's very natural for all of us to focus our lives on the smaller story that began at our birth, ends at our death. So we got to make the best of it. You only go around once, so get all that you can. And that is nothing more than feeding narcissism and self-centeredness. My life has to work. And then in the smaller story, God becomes somebody who's supposed to help us make our lives work. And when he doesn't, we get disillusioned with our faith. And when he does, we get proud that obviously God has favored us with all these wonderful blessings. So either way, we lose. Either we're proud or we're discouraged. But the larger story, which began eternity past and continues into eternity future, has its center in the work of Christ on the cross. And the larger story is going to become a realized reality when he comes back. So I am very consciously thinking about living the larger story by saying my real life begins at the cross, and my real life is fully actualized at the coming, and it goes on into heaven. So that's a brief summary of what I mean by larger story, smaller story. But I think your point is incredibly well taken. All right, so Christ is going to come back. Then what? It's going to be a long time doing what? And a couple of things occurred to me along this line. One of the reasons I wrote the book, Waiting for Heaven, several reasons, but one was I began to look back on my 20 or 30 years. I'm 75 years old now, back in my 20s, 30s, 40s, up into the present. And I realized I've heard very, very few sermons on heaven. And I thought about, well, I've done a fair amount of preaching. When have I preached on heaven? And I couldn't think of a time that I did. And I began to wonder, why is heaven not a big topic in our modern Christian world? And then I wonder, what's replaced it? And my thought was, and I don't want to sound hypercritical here, so let me just sound concerned as opposed to critical. I think a lot of pastoral work, a lot of sermons really reduce to tips for living that'll make your life work. Here's some biblical principles. Do this and your kids will be fine. Here's some biblical principles. Do this as a husband, you'll have a great marriage. Well, not always. You can live a Christian life and things don't always go well. Then you got to come back and get more tips. And I think that as long as we're not focusing on the eternal reality of heaven, we're focusing on the smaller story with tips for living. And I think that's a problem. And so I began to wonder, well, all right, so what's so exciting about heaven? Well, we read Revelation and no more sorrow, no more tears. All right, lovely spiritual stuff. And then you hear people saying things, and I don't want to argue against this, but it doesn't warm my soul maybe as it should. But, we're going to be in the presence of Jesus. All right, I think that's wonderful. Doing what? We're going to be in the new heaven, new earth. I believe it's going to be the new earth, but we're going to be in the Lord's presence. And the typical old ideas about sitting on a cloud and strumming our harp and all that, we've gone pretty much beyond that, I suppose. But I think we do wonder, exactly help me know what's so attractive about heaven. And here's how I think about that. I think about a couple of things here, but I think about my father, who at 8th grade, he had to drop out of school because his father had died when he was 5. and he had to help support the family. My dad was a very, very intelligent man, never went beyond eighth grade, and he would have loved to have been a Bible scholar. He read the Bible all the time, but he never went to seminary. He wished he could have. He would have loved to have had time just to be a teacher. He could have been a wonderful teacher. Well, I happen to believe that every dream that my father has had is going to be realized in heaven. I wonder what he's doing now. He's not just sitting looking at Jesus. My guess is he's really thinking hard about all the wonderful things he's experiencing and having some really significant conversations with a lot of people that he never had a chance to do down here. But I think some wonderful things are happening, and every dream that has not been fulfilled here is going to be fulfilled there. When I think like that, then my appreciation for heaven grows just a little bit.
Mm.
And maybe that encourages me to do what my book is all about, to wait for heaven.
So, Larry, so what you're saying is there is an aspect of heaven that we look forward to, but what do we do now? What is the process now?
I think the verse that my mind goes to is Romans 8:22, 23, I forget which one, where Paul says the very striking two phrases. He said, now in this life, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly. And he's not saying that we eliminate the groaning, that the groaning is still here because our deepest thirst is not satisfied, and it will not be satisfied until we're with him. Think about what Lewis says. He talks about the inconsolable longing. An old writer in the 1800s talked about we live now in the exhaustion of unsatisfied desire. So how do we live now with longings that are not satisfied? How do we live now in the exhaustion of wanting what we can't fully have until heaven? Well, to me, the whole dynamic of waiting for heaven really frees us from demanding anything now.
Mm-hmm.
And when I learn that everything that I do want, that I do legitimately long for, is going to be my eternal experience, growing and growing and growing, never going to end in its growing. If I get a hold of that in any way at all, and it frees me to demand nothing now, then there's going to be a new freedom for the Spirit to work in me, because by not demanding, because heaven's coming up, by not demanding the blessings I long for now, that really weakens my spirit of entitlement, which is such a natural feeling in all of us in our smaller story. Well, I'm entitled. I'm a good Christian, for goodness sakes. When one of our sons went off the rails in some ways and was giving us great difficulty, I remember getting so mad at God because I had had devotions with him every night. I had taught him the Bible. I had gone to his ball games. I thought I had been a good father. And in some ways I was. And wasn't I entitled to a little more help from God, for crying out loud? And that entitlement spirit, I've worked hard. I should have more money. I don't smoke cigarettes. I shouldn't have cancer. On and on and on. The entitlement spirit comes out. And as long as there's no real thought of waiting for heaven, then there is going to be a demand for the blessings now, and that's going to feed our entitlement spirit, and that's going to keep us out of touch with the Spirit of God. And I think that's a tremendous problem.
I've loved, Larry, often in our conversations where, and you say this often in how you relate to people, when people are saying, I have cancer, I have this wayward child or whatever, and this is what I want. And your response is, of course, that's what you want. And of course, that's what we pray for. And of course, that's what we desire. But, and then you point people to this larger story, to the point, and as we talk about in heaven, you and I have both suffered with cancer, and I recall recently reading a statement by someone that said, it's very difficult to feel close to God with your head in a toilet, someone that was suffering from,
Yeah.
chemotherapy. And yet there is, in the midst of that, of course, you want this to cease. Of course, you want to be healed, of course. But there is a perspective that comes from this, what you're just talking about is the larger story, the idea of heaven. How does somebody incorporate that into then what is the process of thinking that someone comes through? Because you're in the midst of pain, you're in the midst of suffering. Some have said that pain and suffering is the Achilles heel of our faith. What is the process that we go through to recognize that? I know that's easier said than accomplished, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, James talks about when troubles come, consider it an opportunity. And then what does he say? An opportunity for great joy? What on earth is he talking about? I don't have any steps. I don't have step one, step two, step three to answer your important question. Here, do this, do that, and then maybe you'll have a greater appreciation for heaven. What I would simply say, as strongly as I know how, is remain open and eager for the work of the Spirit to free you from the shackles of your entitlement spirit and to free you to whet your appetite for what's coming up in heaven, to free you from demanding. And if you're simply remaining open, I remember it was about, a year and a half, 2 years ago, I was having breakfast with another friend, like I was having breakfast with you when I got the bad news about cancer. It seems that the Lord arranges these things. I was having breakfast with Jim, good buddy of mine, when I got word from my oncologist who was treating my other kind of cancer to tell me I now had leukemia and had to go to the hospital right away. Well, long story short, I spent 33 days in the hospital, and I've never had a holier, more joyful experience in my life than those 33 days in the hospital.
Wow.
I can't tell you the steps that I took to get there. All I can tell you is this: it's not to my credit. The only part that I had in that, and this is true, I'm not overstating it. I'm really not. It may sound like I'm talking about fairyland here, but I'm really not. When I got to the hospital, I remember thinking, I have no right to complain about having leukemia. I live in a world that is fallen, and God hasn't changed the world yet. And He's using these opportunities for me to do to work on my soul in some form. And I remember I went to bed every night. Well, I was in bed every day, but when they turned the lights out to hopefully get some sleep in the hospital, which you don't. But I remember just saying, Lord, I'm open. I don't know what's going on. I don't like being here. I can't tell you that, gee, it's wonderful to have leukemia. What a great opportunity for joy. I didn't feel that at all. I didn't want leukemia. I wanted to cure it. I didn't want to be in the hospital. I thought I'd be in for a couple of days. The doctor said you'll be in from 30 to 60 days. And that blew me away. I had no idea. But that first night in the hospital, after hearing all this, I remember just praying with the lights out and moving into a private room. And I said, Lord, I'm open. If there's anything you want to do right now, I'd sure prefer it if you want to cure me so I could leave tomorrow morning, but I'm open to whatever your sovereign plan is. And I would just get some strange thoughts. And every morning in those 33 days, I got up, grabbed my Bible, grabbed my pen, grabbed a piece of pad of paper. I wrote 13 articles during my 33 days in the hospital that were really, really significant expressions of what God was doing in my soul. And when I had visitors come, obviously my wife, my children, some good friends, some others would come. And I was just glad to see them. I was chipper, I was friendly, and it wasn't work. It wasn't like I was trying to be a good Christian in the middle of a hospital bed. It wasn't that at all.
Mm.
So I really believe if you want to get a hold of what it means to wait for heaven, to groan inwardly, wishing things were different. Of course, I wished I wasn't in the hospital, but waiting eagerly, you've just got to be open and tell the Lord, I'm not stubbornly demanding anything. If I'm mad, I'll let you know that. But my bottom line is I'm really open to whatever you're doing, because somehow I believe you're good, because I cannot deny the cross of Christ. That's my final proof of your goodness and your love. So I cannot believe that you're not loving me now. I cannot believe that you're not doing me good now, even though you're not curing my cancer. So you're doing me good in some other way. I don't know what that means, Lord, but I'm open to it. And I ended up knowing a level of joy for those 33 days that I wish I continued for the last year and a half. And it hasn't, but those were 33 wonderful days.
Seeing the eyes, the hands of Jesus, and how desperately He loves us when we're in the midst of that spirit of entitlement. You owe me, God. I've done the right
Yes.
things. Or even if I didn't do the right things, but I've confessed them, you owe me. That spirit of entitlement melts away when we see the unending love of Jesus with His hands open to us. Our pastor
Yes.
often says, Jesus loves you and there's nothing you can do about it. Of course, you can reject it, but there's nothing you can do it. He is going to love you. And through that spirit of entitlement, through that spirit of you owe me, God, so often that is what comes where we just meet the crossroads come of where am I going to go? Am I going to live the smaller story? Am I going to live the larger story? And even looking back on my own cancer experience changed my whole direction for life. It changed my ministry. It changed everything. And some of the closest times I had with God were, in
Yes.
that times of throwing up from the treatments and everything else. Of course, we don't want that. Of course, we want to, have God take that away. But there is something deeper when we get to that spirit of entitlement. And so often that comes, am I just feeling entitled to what you owe me, God? Or is there something that's deeper? Is there a larger story? Is there something of eternal significance here? Live life in view of eternity. Um, so much. I know there's a lot of speculation of what all heaven's going to be like. We lost our 13-and-a-half-year-old dog this week. I wept and
Hmm.
wept and wept. And I sure hope the dogs are back in heaven. I look back to the Garden of Eden. I say there was lion, and then Revelation talking about the lion and the lamb. I sure hope my dog's there. We don't know
No
all of these
snakes.
things. What's that?
No snakes.
No snake. Yeah, so we'll eliminate snakes and mosquitoes. But other than that, but there is something that's significant beyond that, and that's that there's something that's this larger story of living with Jesus, and that gives a lot of hope in the midst of our suffering. Larry, I don't want to end this without any final thoughts of what you'd like to say about this idea of heaven. Are there other things that you want to talk about before we tie this up?
Well, I believe that I've shared hopefully some of the core elements of it, but some shameless advertising here. If people want to get more thoughts about this larger story category and waiting for heaven, uh, get on the web of largerstory.com. Largerstory.com will get you on the Larger Story, which is a ministry that's just beginning now. It's underway. That is sponsored by my older son, who wants to give a legacy for me since I'm turning into an old man. It's basically is to continue some of the directions that the Lord has led me, and bringing in others who are going to think better than I and develop all these thoughts about Larger Story, etc. It's largerstory.com. And then a book coming out called Waiting for Heaven, Freedom from the Incurable Addiction to Self is the subtitle. And that can be pre-ordered now. And I guess I'm just thinking, the older I get, the more heaven is meaning to me. And the more I'm open to the Spirit's work, and the more, let me finish with this, the more I'm really struggling. I don't think the Christian life is lived on a broad road. It's lived on a narrow road. And the word for narrow, thlipsis in the Greek, really means anguish. So there are some struggles in the Christian life. I'm doing a series on Jeremiah pretty shortly, and I'm calling the whole sermon series the success of a failed prophet. And all I mean by success was 40 years of ministry that had no impact on anybody that was visible, and he never quit on God. He persevered through discouragement and remained faithful despite adversity. That's a godly man. And I'd like to go to my grave persevering no matter what coming up tomorrow, being faithful no matter what adversity I'm going to face again tomorrow. That's what I want, because heaven's coming up, and that's going to satisfy me eternally.
That's beautiful, Larry. Thanks so much for sharing with us in these 3 sessions on meaningful conversations. And of course, as Larry has mentioned, you'll find more about his ministry at largerstory.com and through his pre-release of his book, soon to be released. And then, of course, you can find more at our website, christianuniversity.org, and the whole soul care series, where Larry walks through in 40 lessons, all available for free. And we just trust that'll be a ministry to you as well. So thanks for joining us, Larry. This has been a real treat for me personally.
It's been a privilege, Heaven.
All right. God bless you, and thanks for being with us.